I am only here to introduce the chairman of the US Studies Centre, Mark Bailey, to welcome you this evening. Mark.
Thanks, John. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name, as John has indicated, is Mark Bailey. I'm the chair of the United States Studies Centre, and on behalf of the Centre's board of directors, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this conference dinner this evening. I begin by paying my respects to the Gadigal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather, and to all their elders past and present. To our international guests, thank you for making the effort to be with us for this first-of-a-kind conference for Australia. I want to acknowledge members of the Diplomatic Corps here with us this evening. Her Excellency, Ms. Pernille Cadel, Ambassador of Denmark. His Excellency, Mr. Mark Glaser, High Commissioner of Canada. His Excellency, Mr. Anil Kumar Nair, High Commissioner for Singapore. His Excellency, Mr. Andrew Needs, High Commissioner for New Zealand. Mr. Sashihi Takuda, Consul General of Japan, Sydney. And Ms. Sarah Quigley, Acting Consul General and Senior Trade Commissioner, Consulate General of Canada. I also want to warmly welcome our dinner guests and panellists from the Australian Government, Mr. Andrew Shearer, the Director General of the Office of National Intelligence, Ms. Megan Quinn, PSM, Secretary of the Department of Industry, Science and Resources, and Mr. David Fredericks, PSM, Secretary of the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water. How we reconcile security and prosperity in a world of intense strategic competition and economic interdependence is the topic of this conference. Prior to the delivery of the budget, in a recent op-ed in one of our national broadsheets, the Treasurer of Australia, Dr. Jim Chalmers, said the following: "We recognise that in facing the most challenging strategic environment since World War II, economic resilience is an essential component of ensuring our national security." I'd like to thank the Treasurer for the valuable pre-marketing endorsement he gave our conference. The quality and quantity of attendees here today and this evening are testimony to the accuracy of his comments and opinion. The most obvious and compelling reason why it is necessary that we discuss and hopefully gain insight, as I had indicated earlier today, into this issue is the fact that in last year's Defence Strategic Review, the warning time for a potential conflict involving Australia in our region was reduced from more than a decade to 0. Now, this is a very inconvenient to nearly every Australian business, as it means they can't dismiss the risk as outside the time horizons of their 5 or 10-year IRR models. And those in business know being able to price and mitigate risk is an intrinsic part of remaining in business. The other touch point for me as to why this is so important for Australia's business community is that when I asked a senior executive of a top 10 ASX-listed company at one of the Centre's upscale workshops last year as to how they assess or quantify geostrategic risk for their business, the response was, "We don't." There was an awkward pause after that. So you can see that this is the beginning of a vital but not well understood topic. This event would not have been possible without the support of our partners. I would like to again recognise our major partners, the Minerals Council of Australia, Microsoft and the Asia Natural Gas and Energy Association. To Tanya Constable, Mike Yare, Paul Everingham from those respective organisations, thank you for not simply your support, but for your grasp of the importance of the topics we're addressing at this conference. To our media partner, the Financial Times, and to the Australian Government, we thank you for your support. I would also like to thank everyone at the Centre for putting on such a great event. There are too many to name everybody, so I won't name anybody, but you know who you are. Thank you. This conference embodies the ethos of the United States Studies Centre and what we call our theory of impact. It starts from a recognition that in today's complex world, challenges we face are increasingly horizontal. They cut across disciplines and policy areas, even though our structures in government, business and elsewhere remain largely vertical. The challenges we face can't be solved in silos, nor can they be solved from only one perspective. Bringing together government, business, independent experts and civil society for dialogue and debate is at the heart of our approach at the US Studies Centre. I encourage all here tonight who may not be familiar with the breadth of the Centre's work to engage with us on our work program and your areas of interest. Finally, if you would indulge me for a couple of minutes, and Mike, you guys usually a bit white when I start to go off ad lib, don't worry. There has been a lot of interest today on the outcome of the US president, and generally on the outcome of the US presidential election and the impact that it will have on Australia and its allies. In the media, and the commentariat, it will be an understatement to say that there have been a range of views expressed about the impact of the election result. There are those who advise to distance ourselves from the US and break from the alliance we have with America. I would just simply ask those who put those views forward, what alternative are you suggesting? I've been involved in the Australian-US relationship for the past 25 years from a business perspective and the past 10 years in my role at the Centre. During that time, it has become incontrovertibly evident to me that the US is an indispensable and enduring partner of Australia. I am confident that whatever the result of the election, the US will continue to be an indispensable and enduring partner of Australia, continuing to underwrite our peace and prosperity because of our friendship and our shared values. With that, let me again welcome you to this evening. We'll now have our entree, and before Mike Green will bring our distinguished panel on stage. Thank you. Enjoy the evening.
All right, thank you. Sorry again to interrupt what must be really terrific conversations around the room. We're going to have a bit of a palate cleanser between our entree and our main course. We're going to have a panel with practitioners who will hopefully take the ideas that were presented today and debated and actually be responsible for executing Australia's economic security strategy and policy. So I'll ask them to join me on stage. Andrew Shearer, Director General of the Office of National Intelligence, friend of many, many years, veteran of CSIS, among other think tanks and government positions. Megan Quinn, PSM, that's for Americans, that's Public Service Medal. She's the Secretary of the Department of Industry, Science, and Resources. Can you move over one, Andrew? Sorry. I knew when you were at CSIS, you always wanted to do that, didn't you? And David Fredericks, PSM, who's Secretary of the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment, and Water. Great. So not this one. Apparently. Andrew worked with me at CSIS for 2 years, and he was always taking my chair. So these are the practitioners who will have to execute on the brilliant ideas that we continue to develop throughout this conference. We'll be brief because we want to get back to the tables and our main course. But let me ask you first, reflecting on what you heard today and the debate, how do each of you think about the role of your department or agency in crafting and implementing economic security policies for Australia? I'd also be interested in your view on the all-of-government effort. We heard today from our American, Korean, Japanese, and EU colleagues that there are national strategies or statements on economic security. There are in the White House or in the Prime Minister's office in Japan or the Presidential office in Korea, economic security senior directors. So in addition to talking about sort of how you're approaching this from your department, what are your thoughts on whether this is bespoke or a sort of national strategy or how this unfolds sort of bureaucratically? We'll start with Andrew and go down the line.
Well, thank you, Mike, and to the Centre and John Kunkel. What a fantastic event, brilliant timing, great topic, fabulous speakers. So thank you. Really learnt a lot from today. Just tell a sort of personal anecdote. I joined the intelligence community 35 years ago, just as the Berlin Wall was coming down. President Bush declared a new world order and we moved into the period of globalisation, and I thought, what a bummer. As a bright young intelligence analyst, I'm joining a dud business and it doesn't have much of a future. Well, it turns out it kind of does. And of course, we're right back in the middle of this much more contested, fragmented, challenging environment. And when I listened to Liz this morning laying out the contours of this long-term structural systemic contest between China and the United States, and when I listened to Stephen Kennedy lay out, I thought in a really masterful and thoughtful and intellectually rigorous way, the framework that the Australian government is bringing to this, I thought we've really come a profoundly long way. What's the role of intelligence in that world? Well, picking up on Steve's small yard, high fence, I was thinking about this, and it seems to me we're kind of the landscape designer and the quantity surveyor, where they're advising on where the fence should go and what the contours look like. We're probably the back-to-base monitor who's hopefully alerting government and our societies to whether someone's planning to get over the fence or under the fence or maybe through the fence, and probably have a bit of a hand in designing that fence. That's flippant, of course, but what I would say is in a world where the old silos that existed when I started in national security have completely broken down, I spend an enormous amount of time with my colleagues up here on the stage and others across our government working on these issues and working on them in a different way, a much closer, much more integrated way, and a way that frankly has brought challenges for my community, the intelligence community, where I think the old stereotype might have been that, as someone said earlier today, everything's a nail and, I've got a hammer and I'm going to whack it. I think the view was that we were going to come along and just say no, no, no. And I think within that framework that Steve articulated, I really see our role as working with colleagues across government, including and especially in the non-national security portfolios, and I guess we're all national security portfolios now, but how do we think about science and technology? How do we think about the renewable energy grid in a way that we can deliver our net zero commitments affordably, but without jeopardising our sovereignty and our national security? And that is, yes, sometimes saying no. That particular investment is just cannot be mitigated. How do we mitigate? How do we work together to find mitigations? And in some cases, probably in many cases, how do we just tolerate that and move on to the next problem? So I think we're working together in a completely different way, and and I think you're going to come back to it, Mike. The other part of this, of course, is there was a time in Australia and most other developed economies where governments owned all of the critical infrastructure and most of the technology. Those days, of course, are long over, and what that means is we cannot provide security without bringing in a whole-of-nation approach, not just a whole-of-government response. And that means partnering much more proactively with business, building up trusted relationships with business and with our most important international partners, many of whom are here tonight.
I would observe that the evolution of economic security consciousness and debates in a lot of democracies started with the intelligence community. I mean, that would be the story for the UK, I would argue, with Huawei, for Israel with investment, and then often the other departments and ministries are sort of shocked. It does strike me that here, everyone's at the table from the get-go, trying to figure it out. Megan, your department, Industry, Science and Resources, I picture as being the one inside the fence, inside the high walls in a way. That's sort of what's at stake as national assets and national competitiveness and resilience. How have you and how has the department thought about this issue set?
So I was going to start with when I thought of the lineup here today, I thought it sounds a bit like a start of a bad joke. We've got a national security advisor, an economist and a lawyer who walk into a ballroom. And the reason why that's really important is that the diversity of thought that Australia brings to these issues within government is quite striking. There is always a multidisciplinary approach by institutional structure about how Cabinet consider these things, but also in the public service working together in centres of excellence that then bring their expertise. So Andrew's national security, the policy line agencies, our kind of central agencies as we call them, Treasury, Finance and Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. And so for those of you who don't know the portfolio that I kind of try and keep an eye on, it's incredibly diverse. And one of the really interesting things is national security issues touch on almost all of it. So if you think about the resources bit, there's gas, national security element of gas, how does it work in the region and with our neighbours. There's things to do with nuclear waste management, which clearly got a security element, technology, even in science in terms of how we're doing it, regulation of artificial intelligence. So on all of what we do, you might think from the outside that the Department of Industry, Science and Resources, it's all about business, it's all about either spending money or not spending money, depending on what the view is. But one of the really interesting things is how important the integration of economics and national security and then thinking about the tools that we use as well. So in terms of whether we're inside or outside the fence, I think that comes down to why we have the fence to start with, because, and this is, I'm an economist, so just in case you didn't know, the economist bit of the joke. And so one of the famous economist jokes is that, someone asks, how do you open this? And an engineer will say, we'll heat it up and it'll burst. A scientist will say, well, we'll drop it from a height and it'll break open with gravity. And an economist will say, I'll just assume a can opener. And so one of the most important things that we do is analysing the source of the shock is sort of an economic term. National security people do it as well. So really understanding the basics of what's happening in the system and therefore what tool to apply and what response to have. So we spend a lot of time thinking about the analytics of a problem. So critical minerals, what is the role for government? What's the role for business? What's the role for regulation, etc.? But we can't do that without assessing all the information. And that's where we need to engage with a lot of diversity of views to be able to think through those issues. And I'll come back later about how I think business could learn a little bit more about how we think about it in the public service.
David, I may be wrong, but when I think of your portfolio, I see an immediate tension. In a perfect world, if your goal was to reduce CO2 emissions, tackle the climate challenge, you'd want no tariffs or limitations on access to the cheapest, fastest solar panels and so forth. But of course, you also cover energy and energy transitions, and that's a highly competitive geopolitical space. How do you resolve those tensions? How does your department think about its multifold agenda in this space?
Yeah, so thank you for that. It's a nice way to intro a couple of thoughts that I just wanted to put forward. Can I just say firstly, just thank you for everybody for attending and taking an interest in this. For us as senior public servants, it is gratifying to know that this collection of people are interested in how we strategically think about our department and what our missions are. So I thought that, riffing off the topic, a practitioner's view, that I'd have a bit of a stab at explaining to you how I and my leadership team strategically think about this necessity to tackle the big economic challenge at the same time as we are tackling the big national security challenge. And the starting point for us is, my department is the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water. And I suspect that most of you would sit there and think, well, that's an economic department. We can pretty reasonably put that tag on the department, and that's true. We are charged with the domestic policy that is necessary to drive the decarbonisation of the Australian economy and the energy transformation that necessarily is compelled by that. But the reality is, and George is here from DFAT, My department is also a department of national security and foreign policy. As a department, my department has incredible influence in the conduct of foreign policy in this country and in ensuring the national security of this country. And I can give you some examples of that. I'll be really honest with you. Strategic thinking, my charge to my department is whenever we are thinking about domestic policy, that we need to also think about how it might be able to reinforce Australia's national interest and national security objectives. So that's a responsibility I think we now, as public servants, carry. In the more difficult world that we face, we can't afford the luxury of senior public servants thinking only of the particular interest that we are charged with. We have an added responsibility to find opportunity to reinforce Australia's national interest as well. And across my portfolio, I could give you ample examples of that, but just a couple of quick ones. COP negotiations. It's interesting for you all to know that there was a time when COP negotiations, you all know what the COP negotiations are around climate change. There was a time when they were very much a self-contained international negotiation about how to tackle climate change. The reality is geopolitics now is a very important influence on COP discussions. It's interesting, if you know, Australia belongs to a group called the Umbrella Group, which interestingly includes the United States, New Zealand, Canada, Japan, Australia, and now the United Kingdom, and a couple other like-minded countries. So here's an example where, as a department, when we go forth and negotiate in COP, we're seeking climate objectives, and we understand that there are also geopolitics at play. And that applies across, when my team go to the COP on biodiversity these days, the thinking that is just a COP about how to advance biodiversity is old thinking, and we need to think about geopolitics. The reason why I have a very strong relationship with Andrew, and my department has a very strong relationship with ONI and DFAT, is we exhaustively go to them to seek their guidance on how we should prioritise our bilateral effort. So as an example, I'm off to Indonesia next week and then Singapore. That's not an accident. That is not only been driven by my policy imperatives, that is also being driven by Andrew's and George's advice to me about how I should be prioritising the work of my department on bilaterals. So at the multilateral level, we strategise now to have the deepest understanding we can of geopolitics and the impact we can have on it in the interests of Australia. In our bilateral relationships, we prioritise on the same sort of basis. And then, frankly, as we do our domestic work, we now approach policy exactly as Megan said. We approach policy now understanding that we need to obviously think about opportunity for Australia, but we restlessly seek to ensure that that policy, if it can reinforce relationships that are important to us in geopolitics. So the pithy example of that is in hydrogen, where this government, I think, has made some very important investments in the growth of the green hydrogen industry. It's premised on crowding in private sector investment. It's fundamentally about ensuring that Australia can play our role as a green hydrogen producer, not just for ourselves, but for our allies and our like-mindeds. And so you get the double benefit of domestic benefit and international benefit. That's the art of leadership in Australian government today.
David, you said two things just now I want to pick up on, but let me start with the first, which is when you opened by thanking the audience for their level of interest. We have a diverse group of business leaders from different sectors here.
Yeah.
Energy and minerals, finance, tech, and aerospace. And we heard earlier today when we had a panel of business thought leaders The main thing they want from government is predictability and consistency. There's a lot they want, but that's the main thing. But let me ask you, starting with David, in reverse order, what do you want from industry? How does industry work with your department? What are the mechanisms? And what does industry need to know about your strategy on these issues? We'll start with David and go this way.
So let me start by saying, in many ways, it's music to my ears, what you said about what industry wants, because we know that. Right? So I fundamentally believe that my job in setting policy is to try to give the greatest certainty that we can to industry and to business to allow them to invest. If there's a story of the last 10 or 15 or 20 or 25 years in my broadly defined world, it's that uncertainty in policy settings causes difficulty for investment. So as a public servant with responsibility for trying to influence those settings, I know I need to try to strive for certainty. And it is on the basis that sometimes business won't necessarily like the nature of that certainty, but I do know and understand and respect that they will like the certainty. And that's an important distinction, but it's one that gives us great hope to be able to influence. So certainty is the first thing. And then the second thing, the reality is, I think the philosophy of my department, and this is enduring, and I think you see it very strongly in the Future Made in Australia package, which my department, which Megan's department, Treasury, to your point about crowding in government, that was a massive collective effort from a range of senior people and organisations across government. It's fundamentally about crowding in private sector investment. And there will be different policy levers that you pull in different circumstances where we may, as Megan said, where we make judgments about what is the best tool to maximise that private sector investment. It will vary. It may be tax, it may be grants, it may be R&D. It'll depend on the sector. It will depend on the level of maturity of the sector. But the binding principle is find the best policy mechanism by which to crowd in private sector investment. And can I say, if we are getting it right in terms of having those domestic sectors or those domestic settings reflect Australia's international needs as well, then we are actually crowding in private sector investment in aid of Australia's national interest more broadly as well. So, can I be honest? I don't think it's the job of industry or business to think to itself, how can I invest in order to maximise Australia's national interest? That would be an unfair ask. In many ways, the joy of our job is I need to strategise policy outcomes that will cause the private sector to invest in sectors and in industries which are both important to Australia's domestic success, but also have the capacity to reinforce our national interest objectives. What do we need from that? We just need communication. Yep. I mean, I was talking to Tanya before, and can I just say I was a secretary during the COVID period under the previous government. I think the proudest achievement of government and the business sector during the COVID period was we learnt that we get the best results when we consult deeply with each other. And the human instance of that is public servants in my department now are willing and want to pick up the phone and talk to business, because I know I will get the best policy outcome if we've consulted exhaustively. I exhaust my people on my expectation of them to consult. It's an obligation I have. I impose that obligation on my staff, and at the end of the day, I know it's the right thing to do because I'll get the best outcome. So it is that engagement. It's engagement and the capacity for business to step back and understand at times why we might be adopting the positions that we adopt.
So Megan, your department's first name is industry, so I assume you have lots of communication mechanisms and channels and networks. But in this emerging issue set of economic security, where you're trying to balance efficiency and prosperity against national security, what does industry need to know about how your department's thinking about it, and how can they help, and how do you intend to help them?
So when I think about, like, a lot of the framing that I would take, it comes back to the certainty issue that David raised, is why is business not doing something in certain circumstances is a really important question. And it's important to stay really open to that and really dig into that question. And a lot of what we talked about earlier today was that there are some risks that businesses can't insure against. So there's a difference between certainty and managing risk. But if you happen to be a mid-sized critical minerals company and you're out there touting for funding from the financial system, and they say, who are your main competitors? And you say, oh, it's just a small country to the north starting with C. So
Cambodia?
Well, yeah, so Cameroon, yep. what's their, and so we've created over a long period of time a set of legal arrangements for a market-based democracy, and our businesses operate within that. And then there's some things they just can't insure against. They can't insure against a state actor using its balance sheet and its taxing powers to do certain things. And the way that kind of manifests itself often in an investment decision is people can't price risk, so they don't want to enter that transaction, or they have a different discount rate. So they say, I want that payoff. I think, Mark, you mentioned it at the opening, that payoff within 5 or 10 years. And that then comes into the pricing of the deal. And so companies turn up and say, oh, I'd like to discount rate this in 5 years, please. And other people might say, well, I'm happy to pay it off over 30, so they can pay a different price. And so the question is, what's the role for government in a situation where governments can actually insure some of these risks because they've got a taxing base and they've got regulation? And governments typically have longer discount rates than private companies. So we can't out-China China because that would fundamentally change our basis of our market-based economy. So that there is a role for government to step in those limited circumstances where the discount rates don't line up and where the insurance, the risk can't be insured by private capital, to co-invest or think about regulatory architecture. And so what we need to do is work with business to really understand why it is businesses aren't doing certain things, and then think about the appropriate tools. There used to be a saying in public policy about rent seekers. I spent 20 years in the Australian Treasury, and it was like, oh, rent seekers are going to turn up. Big business is just always looking for a handout. But the reality is that there are circumstances in which businesses looking for co-investment, for regulatory skin in the game, but also we have information that we can then share in a co-investment environment. If we have a working relationship with a company, inevitably we share more information. And so from big business, they need to be curious about why they're not doing it and really test the boundaries on that. And then also from a government, we need to think about whether it is in the national interest to take some of those risks, change some of those discount rates. And then the tool that you use might be direct investment, it might be regulation, it might be co-investment, it might be just talking to people nicely and getting them to kind of work through the issues. Or it could be access to some information that Andrew might have that might help them make a different decision. So open dialogue is really important, but also the business community really needs to understand why are they not investing and think deeply about that, and is there a solution in the national interest that they can come up with? And my door is always open.
Andrew, I'm guessing that you meet with the private sector a lot more than your predecessors probably did, because you have analysis information they need and they have understanding of markets and facts on the ground that you need. But what's your message? How do you find those interactions?
I think one of the most surprising revelations for me about my job once I started doing it was exactly how much time I spend with private sector leaders in Australia. And if you ask me what I'm looking for in those interactions, my answer would be trusted partnerships. And I think that's easy to say. It sounds a bit glib, but it actually coming from history, culture, and stereotyping. Trust has to be earned, and from time to time, I think if I or one of my Intel agency counterparts darkened a senior business leader's door, the response might have been a bit frosty a few years ago, like, we're making a lot of money here, can you sort of move along? And I think a concern that we saw the world through a very black and white sort of binary lens, you know, there's risk here, so shut it down. What I would say, and a key part of my message when I have these engagements, is prosperity and security are two sides of the same coin. We can't have prosperity as a country without security, but we can't have security without prosperity. And so we have to demonstrate by what we do and what we say to business leaders that we understand that Australia needs a strong, open, dynamic, flexible economy with productivity growth, and that is absolutely essential to pay for the resilience and the defence and other capabilities we are going to need to navigate this period. And that comes back to partnership in the sense that I can't secure our most vital supply chains. None of us can on our own, actually. I can't secure our critical infrastructure, most of which is owned by the private sector. We can only do that in partnership. I can help inform our business leaders about what we're seeing in the world, the sorts of trends that we're focused on, worried about, bringing to the attention of government. But they have a much richer, much more detailed understanding of our supply chains, what's happening in resources and other markets, that's invaluable to inform our analysis. So this is really sort of symbiotic. And the other thing I'd say about trust is you earn trust by taking risk. And in all relationships, that means taking people into your confidence and perhaps exposing a little more than sometimes you might feel comfortable with. Intelligence officers don't always feel comfortable exposing information, but we have to lean into that risk as a community, and we're trying to do that in our individual interactions, but also when we engage the public more broadly.
Senator, you've been very active, again, probably unprecedented in the role in what people might call intelligence diplomacy, but basically meeting with, collaborating with, sharing assessments with your counterparts, Five Eyes, of course, but more broadly. And you don't have to tell us classified information if you don't want to.
Thank you.
But feel
Maybe
free
after dinner.
At least after wine.
We'll let Megan do that. But does economic security, do these issues come up? I would imagine with countries like the US and Japan, but how often in your exchanges with counterparts do you find that other governments, maybe even surprising governments, are thinking about this problem set?
I would say it's become much more central in all of our intelligence exchanges, whether with our traditional partners, as you said, the Five Eyes, our other closest intelligence partners, countries like Japan, the ROK, but increasingly in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And I think the way I think about intelligence diplomacy, and we've talked about this over many years, Mike, is if two like-minded governments share an information picture about what's happening in their shared external environment, they share that situational awareness, they're much more likely to arrive at aligned policy responses to those challenges. And that's why when we conduct our intelligence diplomacy activity, we do it in a way that's fully integrated with the work of DFAT and our other policy agencies. It's very much a supporting function, but sharing information, and again, it's the same principle. You build trust by sharing things that are important to you and sensitive, and you wear some risk along the way, but in doing that, you build that trust and that alignment.
And Megan, I imagine your counterpart agencies would be METI in Japan, Commerce and so forth, and there would be long-standing relationships, but same question, to what extent are you finding in those dialogues the issues we've been talking about, investment screening, export controls, and all the rest, are featuring? And do you feel like the mechanisms we have for that collaboration with like-minded states are sufficient, or I'm not asking you to announce a new forum, although feel free to, we have media here, but do you feel like the mechanisms we use will probably evolve to be able to capture this set of problems in Australia's or America's or Japan's international dialogue?
So I'm going to be slightly controversial in the sense that I think we have too many mechanisms. So we do have mechanisms and we do engage and work through things. What's kind of interesting is that we're layering mechanisms on top of each other. So there's the trade engagement, there's the standards engagement, there's the investment engagement. More recently, as in investment rules, in terms of framework rules, then you add on top, and then more recently there's been the kind of the more direct government investment. And if I just use critical minerals as an example, you know, I asked the team when I first took on this role to give me a landscape of the international architecture that we're involved in, and it was the classic noodle nation with lots of different forums, and then on top of that we've added really important relationships with the United States in terms of the critical minerals and climate change compact. We've got MOUs with countries, we've got supply chain studies with lots of places, etc. So I feel like there's a lot of analysing the problem that we talked about earlier today. And I just want to make the point that at 2010, as we heard this morning, was when the rare earth intervention from China into Japan was. And we're now in 2024, and it's 14 years of mostly discussion. And I believe that the time has come for us to use all those mechanisms that we've got, all those connections we've built, all that building of a common understanding of the problem, and move to fixing the problem, which means really addressing, putting money on the table. If we want supply chains in critical minerals to be changed, we need to spend the money on building the supply chains. And that means we need deals, we need people to pay prices that are comparable, we need regulations to be sorted out in terms of ESG, we need market mechanisms, we need investment bankers to pay attention. So we need we need to move to action. I feel like we've got a lot of architecture, and I'm very action orientated. I would like to move to the solution stage. And I could apply that to space policy in terms of using our engagements to drive better regulation in the space industry. I could apply that to artificial intelligence in terms of having an ecosystem. I do feel like it'll be 5 years past all the harms that we'll have an international arrangement on AI that's comparable. And so we have to actually start speeding up our action. And that is incumbent on collaboration across countries and between different parts of society.
When you said that, too many mechanisms, I noticed that officials from other countries all nodded vigorously, and the think tank people went darn and crossed out recommendation number 5. Last word, David. How do you see it?
So I'll pick up on that theme. It is true, there is a lot of architecture. I suppose the Pollyanna in me says that is a reflection of a very strong desire, particularly from like-mindeds, to come together and to find the opportunities to define the problem together, and then, to Megan's point, to work on solutions that work for each of us. And to your sort of introductory point, the hallmark of much of our international engagement now is to understand that there is a degree of tension in the objectives, the domestic objectives of ourselves and of our partners. And the discourse needs to convince each of us to understand that you can push past those individual interests and find a mutual interest which is more powerful. And that's the sort of relationship that we are seeking to establish in some of the, for example, in hydrogen with Japan as an example. It's why we're leaning in so strongly to the relationship with the United States, because in a world where the United States has introduced the Inflation Reduction Act and the huge economic ramifications for the world economy that has, we need to be working with the United States to find our part in that world. So in many ways, that's healthy. So in many ways, the tension that's inevitably in a world in which each country is looking at its own economic prosperity and security first, I'm actually quite confident that particularly when it comes to allies and like-mindeds, we absolutely have the capacity to push past that and to find mutual advantage, because it's crucial that we do.
That discussion really grounded us nicely. We should let Andrew and Megan and David get their dinner. I encourage you to quiz them on the question they didn't answer about national security strategy, but over the main course, because we have to let them eat. But first, let's thank them for a really insightful presentation.